In the summer of 1324, the most spectacular procession in medieval history crossed the Sahara Desert. At its center was Mansa Musa I, the ruler of the Mali Empire, traveling to Mecca to perform the Hajj pilgrimage. The caravan he brought with him was not simply a royal retinue. It was a deliberate demonstration of incomprehensible wealth, a moving city of people, animals, and gold designed to announce to the world that the ruler of Mali was a king unlike any other on earth. Contemporary accounts describe an entourage of 60,000 people, soldiers, courtiers, slaves, scholars, merchants, and servants, moving in a column that stretched for miles across the desert. 12,000 of those travelers were personal slaves, each carrying a staff of pure gold. 80 camels bore loads of gold dust, each weighing approximately 300 pounds. Heralds walked ahead of the Mansa himself, swinging golden rods. When Musa arrived in Cairo, he distributed gifts so lavishly, to the Sultan, to officials, to merchants, to anyone who approached with a petition, that he reportedly flooded the Egyptian market with gold and depressed the metal's value for more than a decade. An Arab administrator named al-Umari, writing in Cairo years after Musa's visit, described the city as still talking about it. The Mansa who had arrived from the south and scattered gold like a man scattering sand. In Mecca and Medina, Musa continued his distribution. He spent so extravagantly that he ran out of ready cash on the return journey and was forced to borrow money from Egyptian merchants at high interest to complete the trip. The man who had briefly flooded the Mediterranean economy with gold left the holy cities in debt. This paradox, the inconceivable wealth and the sudden insolvency, captures something essential about the Mali Empire. It was a state built on the control of a resource so valuable that its ruler could destabilize distant economies simply by traveling through them. But the mechanisms of that wealth, and the political structure that managed it, contained weaknesses that Musa himself could see, and that would unravel the empire within a century of his death. What follows is the story of how the richest kingdom in medieval history came to an end, not in a single catastrophic moment, but through the slow accumulation of succession failures, raiding pressure, and the loss of the trade dominance that had made everything else possible. To understand the Mali Empire's fall, you have to understand what it actually was. Not a unified state in the modern sense, with administered provinces, a permanent standing army, and a tax-collecting bureaucracy that reached down to the village level. The Mali Empire was something more fluid than that, and more fragile. It was a network of tributary relationships radiating outward from the Mansa's court, held together by a combination of military power, cultural prestige, control of trade routes, and the personal authority of whoever held the title of Mansa. Remove any one of those pillars, and the whole structure wobbled. The founder of that structure was a man named Sundiata Keita. His story comes to us primarily through oral tradition, the Epic of Sundiata, preserved by generations of griots, the professional oral historians of the man-speaking people, and through a handful of Arabic sources written decades or centuries after his death. The details of his biography are legendary in the fullest sense. A prince crippled from birth who could not walk until adulthood, then rose to defeat the sorcerer king Sumenguru Kant of the Sasso at the Battle of Karina around 1235. What is historically certain is the outcome. After Karina, the Mali state emerged as the dominant power of the Upper Niger region, and Sundiata became the founding ancestor around whom man's political identity would crystallize for centuries. What Sundiata built was not a bureaucratic empire. It was a system of tribute and allegiance, organized around the institution of the Mansa. The Mansa was more than a king in the European sense. He was a sacred figure, a mediator between the human and spiritual worlds in the indigenous man framework, who also operated as a Muslim ruler claiming legitimacy through Islamic piety and Quranic learning. This dual religious identity, simultaneously honoring indigenous spiritual practices and performing Islam for the Arab trading partners and scholars who were essential to the trans-Saharan economy, was not hypocrisy. It was statecraft. The Mansa was sovereign to different audiences in different registers, and holding those audiences simultaneously required extraordinary personal skill. The economic foundation that made all of this possible was simple in principle and staggering in execution. The Mali Empire sat astride two of the most valuable commodity streams in the medieval world, gold flowing north and salt flowing south. The gold came from the Bambouk and Bure goldfields in the upper Senegal-Niger basin, the richest placer gold deposits in West Africa. The miners who worked these fields were not Malian subjects in any direct administrative sense. They were local communities who dug the gold and traded it. The Malian state's genius was not in mining. It was in positioning itself at every step of the trade network that moved gold from the mines to the Mediterranean. Malian merchants and soldiers controlled the market towns where gold changed hands. Malian authorities set the terms of trade. Malian garrisons protected the routes. Every transaction produced revenue for the Mansa. By the time that gold reached Moroccan or Egyptian or Genoese merchants, it had passed through layers of Malian intermediaries at every stage. The salt trade was the mirror image. The Taghaza salt mines, far to the north in the Saharan interior, produced slabs of rock salt that were essential currency and dietary necessity across sub-Saharan Africa, where salt was as rare and valuable as gold was in the north. The Malian state gradually extended its authority over Taghaza and the route south from it, inserting itself as the dominant middleman in that flow too. A slab of salt worth 1 unit of value at the Taghaza mine might be worth 8 units in the markets of the Niger Bend by the time it reached the people who needed it. The empire collected a share of every transaction along the route. Between these two commodity streams, gold going north, salt going south, luxury goods from North Africa and the Arab world filtering back, the Mali Empire at its height was generating more commercial revenue than any other polity in sub-Saharan Africa. The cities that sprang up as nodes in this network, Timbuktu, Djenné, Niani, Kumbaisale, were not just trading posts. They were the living infrastructure of a continental economy, full of merchants, scholars, artisans, and administrators from across the Sahara and the Sudan. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan scholar who visited the Mali court in 1352 and 1353, provides the most detailed external description of the empire near its height. His account describes a royal audience of extraordinary theatrical sophistication. The Mansa did not appear publicly without elaborate ceremony. He communicated with his subjects through an intermediary. Even direct speech between a petitioner and the king was considered too informal for court protocol. There was complete security throughout the empire. Ibn Battuta writes that he could travel from one end of the country to the other without fear, that his property was protected, and that justice was swift and reliable. He describes the Niger Bend towns as prosperous and orderly, the markets well-stocked, the merchants confident. He also notes things he found objectionable, including certain customs he considered incompatible with Islamic practice. His presence at the court of Mansa Sulayman, Musa's younger brother, who ruled from 1341 to 1360, gives us a benchmark for what Mali looked like roughly a decade after the golden age of Mansa Musa. Sulayman was a competent ruler who maintained the empire's territorial integrity, conducted diplomatic correspondence with the Sultan of Morocco, and kept the great trading cities functioning. He was not his brother, but he was adequate. The problems that would eventually destroy the empire were already present in his reign, but they were not yet visible from outside. The succession system was the deepest structural problem, and it was built into the manned political order from the beginning. The Mansa's legitimacy derived partly from the Keita clan's founding ancestor Sundiata, but the rules governing which member of the clan inherited were ambiguous enough to produce genuine contest at every transition. The succession could pass from a ruler to his son, or to his brother, or to a nephew, depending on the particular configuration of claims, military support, and factional politics at the moment of transition. There was no clear single rule, and without a clear rule, every royal death was a potential civil war. This was not accidental. In many African political systems, The ambiguity around succession was a feature rather than a bug. It forced potential successors to demonstrate competence through competition, and it gave the governing elite leverage to select among candidates based on their actual abilities rather than simply birth order. In good times, this produced strong rulers. In bad times, it produced chaos. The first visible crack in the system came with the reign of Mansa Musa II, who took the throne in 1360 after a disputed transition that displaced Sulayman's designated heir. Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab historian writing from reports rather than direct observation, describes Mansa Musa II as a ruler who tyrannized his subjects, exhausted the state's reserves, and weakened the empire's military capacity. He is said to have sold the great library of the mosque at Timbuktu, a collection assembled over decades by Musa and Sulayman, to raise funds. Whether this sale literally happened or is a symbolic story about a ruler consuming the empire's cultural inheritance, it captures something true about the reign, a Mansa using up the legacy of his predecessors rather than maintaining it. Mansa Musa II died of sleeping sickness in 1374. His successors were dominated in practice by the Kankoro Sigwi, the Grand Vizier or Prime Minister, and the empire's nominal rulers became increasingly ceremonial figures. This reversal, where the throne's real power passed to a non-royal minister, is a structural signal recognizable in the decline of many complex states. It means the institution of the Mansa had lost its coercive force. A figure who once commanded personal loyalty now required intermediaries to maintain even the appearance of authority. From the 1360s onward, the external pressure that had always existed on Mali's frontiers intensified because the center could no longer respond to it. The Tuareg were the most consequential external force. The Tuareg were Berber-speaking nomads of the Saharan region, skilled riders and raiders who had long operated as guides, traders, and occasional raiders along the desert's southern edge. As Mali's military response capacity weakened, the Tuareg chieftains of the Aglitlit and other clans began moving south with greater boldness, raiding the northern trading towns and eventually asserting permanent control. Timbuktu, which had been the intellectual and commercial jewel of the empire, a city of mosques, madrasas, and merchant networks that drew scholars from Egypt, Morocco, and the Arab world, was sacked by Tuareg raiders around 1400. The city had been built by Malian power and was now exposed by Malian weakness. The Tuareg did not destroy Timbuktu, they occupied it and extracted tribute from it, as the Mali Empire itself had once done. But the city was no longer under Malian authority. It was a symbol of everything the empire was losing. From the south, the Mossi kingdoms, particularly Yatunga and Ouagadougou, mounted systematic raids northward into the Niger Bend throughout the late 14th and early 15th centuries. The Mossi were skilled cavalry raiders who could strike deep into the settled agricultural zone and withdraw before a slower Malian infantry response could reach them. They did not seek to establish permanent control initially. They were after livestock, grain, and captives, but the sustained raiding disrupted the agricultural hinterland that fed the Niger Bend cities, and it signaled to every other power on the frontier that Malian military protection was no longer reliable. Here is where the structure of the empire's failure becomes most visible. The Mali Empire had never been primarily a military power. It was a commercial power that maintained just enough military capacity to protect its trade routes. When its commercial revenues declined, as they did when frontier territories began paying tribute to raiders rather than to Nyani, its military capacity declined with them, which made the remaining commercial routes more vulnerable, which reduced revenues further. The spiral was self-reinforcing and very difficult to interrupt once it began. The Malian army at its height had relied on a combination of cavalry recruited from noble families and allied pastoral groups, infantry levied from subject peoples, and the occasional deployment of the Mansa's own royal guard, which represented the best equipped and most loyal force available. This army was sufficient to overawe most internal challengers, and to deter most external raiders during periods when the Mansa's personal authority was intact and the treasury could pay for campaigns. But it was not the kind of army that could sustain prolonged operations across the enormous distances the empire covered. A raiding force on the Niger Bend could strike, withdraw, and be 100 miles away before a response force assembled at Niani could even begin to march. The geography of the empire, which stretched from the Atlantic coast in the west nearly to Gao in the east, a distance of over 1,500 miles, was its ambition and its vulnerability simultaneously. The great Mansas had solved this problem through speed and reputation, rather than through permanent garrison infrastructure. Mansa Musa, during his 25-year reign, apparently moved fast enough and projected enough personal authority that potential challengers calculated the cost of opposition and declined. His army's effectiveness was partly real and partly a matter of reputation, the accumulated record of successful campaigns that made resistance seem futile. When that reputation eroded, as it did under successors who lacked Musa's combination of military competence and political skill, the calculation changed. Peripheral rulers who had paid tribute because they feared the Mansa now paid tribute more reluctantly, or stopped paying, or started looking for a stronger patron. The Mossi raids illustrate this dynamic precisely. The Mossi kingdoms, Yatunga in particular, were not trying to conquer Mali. They were testing its defenses. A successful raid that met no response was worth repeating. A second successful raid with no effective response was an invitation for a third, larger raid. Over the course of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Mossi shifted from occasional deep raids to something approaching a systematic extraction system in the Niger Bend southern periphery. They did not need to defeat the Mali army in a pitched battle. They only needed to demonstrate, year after year, that the Mali army was not going to come. This lesson was not lost on the Tuareg in the north. The Aglatlit clan's move against Timbuktu around 1400 was not a sudden decision. It was the culmination of decades of Tuareg observation of Malian military weakness. By the time Tuareg forces moved against the city in force, they knew from experience that the Malian garrison could not be reinforced in time to matter. The garrison was probably not negligible in size or quality, but it was isolated. A Malian relief army, if one was assembled, faced a march of weeks through difficult terrain to reach a city that the Tuareg could have stripped and vacated long before it arrived. The Mansas of the early 15th century were not incompetent men, at least not all of them. Some made genuine attempts to recover lost territories and reassert Malian authority over the northern trading cities. But they were operating with reduced resources against enemies who had grown more capable at exactly the moment Mali had grown weaker. The window for recovery narrowed with every passing decade. The decisive blow came not from the Tuareg, who were raiders rather than empire builders, but from the Songhai state on the Niger Bend. The Songhai people had been a significant presence at Gao, the eastern terminus of the Niger Bend trade system, since long before the Mali Empire's rise. Under Mali dominance, the Songhai rulers of Gao had paid tribute and acknowledged Malian suzerainty. As Mali weakened, the Sani dynasty of the Songhai began reasserting control over their immediate territory. By the 1430s and 1440, the Songhai state at Gao was effectively independent and expanding. The ruler who transformed Songhai from a regional power into a continental empire was Sunni Ali, who came to the throne around 1464. Sunni Ali was a military commander of extraordinary energy and personal ferocity. He understood that the trans-Saharan trade system, the economic prize that had made Mali rich, was available to whoever controlled the Niger Bend cities, and he methodically set about taking them. In 1468, Sunni Ali took Timbuktu from the Tuareg. His entry into the city was violent. The Arabic chronicles written by the city's scholars describe him as a tyrant who persecuted the learned men and despoiled the mosques. These accounts are hostile and must be read carefully. Sunni Ali was persecuting a scholarly class that had collaborated with the Tuareg occupiers, and that represented in his eyes a cosmopolitan Islamic literati whose loyalties were to a broader Muslim world rather than to the Songhai state. He was also a ruler whose religious practice mixed indigenous Songhai traditions with Islam in ways the scholars found heterodox. The persecution was real, but it was as much a class conflict between military rulers and scholarly intermediaries as it was a religious one. What is not in dispute is the military reality. Timbuktu, after 1468, was Songhai's. The great city that Mansa Musa had adorned with mosques, that al-Sahili had built audience chambers for, that generations of scholars had made into one of the foremost centers of Islamic learning in Africa, it was no longer Mali's. The symbolic loss was as significant as the economic one. Sunni Ali did not stop at Timbuktu. He turned next to Guinea, the second great commercial city of the Niger Bend. Guinea was a harder target, surrounded by water during the flood season, protected by natural barriers that negated Songhai cavalry advantages. The siege lasted 7 years, from approximately 1466 to 1473. When Guinea finally fell, not through storm but through starvation, Sunni Ali's control of the Niger Bend was complete. The trade infrastructure that had been Mali's economic backbone for 2 centuries was now in Songhai hands. The details of Sunni Ali's campaigns against Mali deserve attention because they reveal something about the strategic logic of the Songhai expansion that the broad strokes of the narrative can obscure. Sunni Ali was not simply a more powerful version of the Tuareg raiders who had preceded him. He was a state builder with a coherent strategic vision. His campaigns targeted the specific nodes in the commercial network that made Mali's wealth possible, not the gold mines, which were too far inland and too defended by local communities to be easily seized, but the cities that processed and forwarded that gold northward. By taking Timbuktu and Guinea, he did not need to conquer Mali's heartland. He only needed to cut off the commercial infrastructure that turned Bambuk gold into trans-Saharan wealth. Once those cities were Songhai's, the revenues that had sustained Malian military power flowed to Gao instead of Niani. Mali could not compete with a Songhai state funded by Mali's own former revenues. The 7-year siege of Guinea is particularly instructive. Guinea was protected by the Niger's seasonal flooding, which turned the area around the city into a series of islands for several months each year. Sunni Ali was an innovative military commander who understood river warfare and used the Niger River as both a highway and a weapon. He maintained his siege through successive flood seasons, using a fleet of war canoes that could operate in conditions where cavalry was useless. His patience was as important as his force. He could not storm the city through its natural defenses, so he waited, maintaining the siege long enough that Guinea's food supply exhausted itself. When the city's defenders finally surrendered, they did so not to a victorious army, but to the arithmetic of starvation, a military reality as unchallengeable as any battlefield defeat. What remained of Mali after 1473 was the original heartland, the upper Niger-Senegal region, the Bambuk goldfields, the territory around Niani where Sundiata had founded the state. The Mansas still held their thrones and their titles and their ancestral ceremonies. They continued to perform the elaborate court ritual that Ibn Battuta had described. But the commercial empire was gone. The great cities were gone. The tribute network that had stretched from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the Hausa states had contracted to a territory that could not generate the revenues to project power beyond its own borders. The Portuguese, who began establishing trading posts on the West African coast in the latter half of the 15th century, introduced a new variable into the equation. Their sea routes offered an alternative to the trans-Saharan overland network, direct access to European markets without the necessity of paying tolls to Malian or Songhai intermediaries. The development of Atlantic sea trade was slow, measured in decades rather than years, and its full economic impact on the trans-Saharan system took a century or more to materialize. But the direction of travel was clear. The logic that had made it profitable to build a great empire in the interior of the continent, control the routes between the gold and the market, was being undermined by a technology that made the routes themselves obsolete. The empire that had once sent a man across the Sahara with 100 camel loads of gold was now a peripheral participant in the continental economy it had once dominated. It is worth pausing here to understand what the Mali Empire had actually been at its height, because the gap between that height and what followed tells you something important about how complex states fail. Timbuktu under Mansa Musa and his successors was not simply a trading post. The Sankor Mosque complex had become one of the great centers of Islamic scholarship in the world, drawing students and teachers from North Africa, Egypt, and the Middle East. The city's libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, works of theology, law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy written and copied by scholars who had come to the Niger Bend, specifically because it was a place of learning and relative prosperity. The scholars who lived there were not provincial figures. They corresponded with counterparts in Fez, Cairo, and Baghdad. They adjudicated legal disputes for merchants from across the Sahara. They trained generations of West African students in the full curriculum of medieval Islamic scholarship. This intellectual culture did not simply disappear when Songhai replaced Mali as the dominant power. Askia Muhammad, who took the Songhai throne in 1493 after defeating Sunni Ali's son, was a devout Muslim who reversed Sunni Ali's treatment of the scholars and actively patronized the madrasas and libraries. Under Askia Muhammad, Timbuktu flourished as a center of scholarship again, now under Songhai rather than Malian patronage. The city was not destroyed, it was transferred. But the state that had created the conditions for its flourishing, the Mali Empire in its confident, expansive Musa-era glory, was gone. The destruction of the Songhai Empire itself in 1591 by a Moroccan army equipped with firearms would eventually scatter the Timbuktu scholars across the Sahara and permanently disrupt the intellectual tradition that had persisted through the Mali to Songhai transition. But that is a different story and a later catastrophe. What matters here is the intermediate question. What does it mean for a state to fall when its institutional culture survives it? The answer the Mali story offers is that the state and the civilization it sustained were not the same thing. The Mali Empire was the political mechanism by which a particular configuration of trade routes, military control, and dynastic legitimacy was maintained. When the mechanism failed, when the succession system produced weak rulers, and then civil war, when the military could not respond to frontier pressure, when the commercial revenues that sustained everything else shifted to stronger rivals, the political mechanism died. But the trade continued, the scholarship continued for a while, the cities persisted, the gold still came out of Bambuk, the camel caravans still crossed the Sahara. What was lost was not the civilization so much as the specific structure of power that had organized and extracted value from it. This distinction matters because it clarifies what kind of failure the Mali collapse actually was. It was not a civilizational apocalypse. It was a structural failure of a particular political system, the Mansa-based tribute empire, to adapt to changed conditions. The system was designed for a specific set of circumstances. A world where the key trade routes ran through territory that Mali could patrol, where no rival power had the military capacity to displace Malian garrisons, and where the Mansa's personal authority was sufficient to bind the tribute network together. Each of those conditions eventually ceased to hold. The succession problem was the first domino. Every major succession crisis diverted military resources from border security to internal factional competition. Every civil war gave peripheral territories a window to reduce their tribute payments or switch their allegiances. Every weak Mansa made the next frontier incursion easier because potential raiders could observe that the response would be slow and inadequate. The succession system was not the only cause of decline, but it was the trigger mechanism for all the others. Consider the trajectory from Mansa Musa's death in 1337 to the loss of Timbuktu in 1433, less than a century. Musa died at the peak of his powers, having organized a state that was, by every external measure, a great success. His son Magan I was quickly displaced. His brother Suleiman governed competently, but faced the first Mossi raids reaching the Niger Bend. Suleiman's succession was contested and produced the destructive reign of Dieta Roman II. After Dieta Roman II, the Mansa's real power passed to the minister. The Tuareg pressure intensified. The towns of the Niger Bend changed hands multiple times. Each transition was an opportunity for the process to reverse, but each transition produced another crisis rather than a correction. There is a particular cruelty in the way institutional decline works. The Mali Empire at its height had developed a court culture, a legal system, a scholarly infrastructure, and a commercial network that were, in aggregate, more sophisticated than almost anything contemporary in the world that the empire's Arabic commentators inhabited. The scholars of Timbuktu knew this. The merchants of Guinea knew it. The griots who preserved the memory of Sundiata knew it. But knowledge of institutional sophistication and the capacity to maintain it are different things. The Mali court, even in its decadent phase, was still conducting its elaborate public ceremonies, still receiving foreign visitors with formal protocol, still performing the rituals of the Keita dynasty's sacred mandate. The form survived the substance for decades. The ceremony continued while the territory shrank. Ibn Khaldun, writing in the late 14th century from reports he gathered from West African scholars and merchants, had a theory about this kind of failure. His concept of asabiya, group solidarity or social cohesion, described the dynamic by which nomadic peoples with strong internal bonds regularly displaced settled, sophisticated, wealthier civilizations that had grown soft with prosperity. The Tuareg nomads who sacked Timbuktu around 1400, the Songhai warriors who besieged Guinea for 7 years. In Ibn Khaldun's framework, these were people with the asabiya that the Mali state had consumed in its own internal conflicts. The Mali Empire had spent a century weakening its social cohesion through succession wars, and had made itself available to be overwhelmed by groups with more of it. There is something to this analysis, though it also flatters the conquerors and underweights the structural economic forces at work. The Songhai expansion under Sunni Ali was not simply the triumph of warrior solidarity. It was a carefully planned military campaign by a ruler who understood the strategic geography of the Niger Bend, who used river warfare and cavalry in combination more effectively than any rival in the region, and who deliberately targeted the specific nodes, Timbuktu, Guinea, that would give him control of the commercial system rather than simply raiding around its edges. Sunni Ali was not a raider who got lucky. He was an empire builder who identified the Mali state's structural vulnerability and exploited it with systematic precision. The final, melancholy irony of the Mali story is that the wealth that made it famous also made it a target. Mansa Musa's Hajj had announced to the Mediterranean world that the interior of West Africa contained gold in quantities that beggar imagination. The 1375 Catalan Atlas, the most comprehensive European map of the medieval world, shows a black African king sitting on a throne in the middle of the continent, holding a golden nugget, labeled as Mansa Musa, Lord of the Negroes of Guinea. European merchants and monarchs looked at that map and understood what it meant. The Portuguese king who funded the exploration of the West African coast in the 15th century was not acting on pure geographical curiosity. He was looking for the gold, and the Songhai leaders who methodically dismantled Malian power were acting on exactly the same knowledge. The gold was real. The trade routes were real. The cities were real. The question was who would control them, and the answer, in the 15th century, was no longer Mali. What Mansa Musa had demonstrated on his Hajj, that the ruler of Mali commanded wealth on a scale that no other medieval monarch could match, turned out to be a demonstration of the maximum, not a description of a durable equilibrium. The wealth was real, but it was not self-sustaining. It required continuous maintenance of the political and military systems that gave Mali its position in the trade network. The moment those systems began to fail, the wealth did not protect them. It simply made them more worth taking. There is a final way to understand the Mali Empire's decline that the historical record makes available, and it has to do with the nature of the state's legitimacy. The Mansa's authority rested on three foundations that reinforced each other: military power, commercial wealth, and a sacred mandate that combined man's spiritual authority with Islamic piety. When military power declined and commercial revenues shrank, the sacred mandate became the last pillar, and a sacred mandate without armies or gold is a very thin kind of sovereignty. The later Mansas were still performing the sacred rituals, still receiving the formal homage of vassals who were increasingly nominal, still conducting public audiences with the elaborate protocol that Ibn Battuta had admired. The ceremony continued, because the ceremony was all that was left. It was not fraud exactly. The Keita family's ancestral legitimacy was real, the Islamic piety was real, the court culture was real. But legitimacy without coercive capacity is not sovereignty. It is memory. The Mali Empire's decline took roughly a century and a half from the death of Mansa Musa to the final loss of the Niger Bend cities to Songhai. That is not a rapid collapse. It is a long, painful process of institutional erosion in which each problem created conditions for the next problem to be worse. The succession system weakened military capacity. Military weakness encouraged raiding. Raiding disrupted trade. Disrupted trade reduced revenues. Reduced revenues weakened military capacity further. The loop was closed, and it was running in the wrong direction. No individual decision at any single point made this outcome inevitable. A succession that produced a ruler of Musa's caliber at the right moment could have reversed the trajectory, as strong rulers occasionally did reverse it temporarily. The empire might have found a way to adapt its tribute system to the new military realities of the 15th century. The Songhai expansion under Sunni Ali might have been checked by a Mali leader with his quality of strategic vision. None of these things happened, not because they were impossible, but because the structural pressures made them increasingly improbable with every passing decade. To see clearly what was lost, consider what Timbuktu represented at the moment of its maximum flourishing. The city had been a seasonal camp for Tuareg nomads before Malian power transformed it into a permanent commercial metropolis. Its position at the point where the Sahara met the savannah made it the natural transfer point between the desert camel trade and the Niger River boat trade. Caravans from Fez, from Tunis, from Cairo arrived at Timbuktu's northern gates carrying cloth, copper, horses, and luxury goods from the Mediterranean world. River boats from Guinea, from Niani, from the Bambuk goldfields arrived at the southern wharves carrying gold, cola nuts, slaves, and the agricultural surpluses of the Niger floodplain. In between the two flows, the merchants of Timbuktu bought and sold and charged commissions, and the Malian state extracted a share of every transaction through a system of tolls, taxes, and merchant licensing. But what grew alongside the commerce was something harder to quantify and more durable. The wealth of trade attracted scholars. Islamic education required books, and books required wealth to copy, scholars to write, and an audience able and willing to pay for them. By the 14th century, Timbuktu had madrasas that attracted students from across the Saharan world, young men from Morocco and Egypt, and the Hausa states who came to study Quranic commentary, Islamic law, Arabic rhetoric, and the mathematical sciences in a city that could support serious intellectual life, because it was also a city of serious commerce. The libraries accumulated. Private family collections of hundreds and thousands of manuscripts, institutional collections attached to the mosques, the accumulated written record of a literate civilization that had grown up in the middle of the continent. The scholars who came to Timbuktu were not marginal figures in the Islamic world. Ahmed Baba al-Timbukti, who would be born in Timbuktu in 1556, after the Mali period but within the scholarly tradition that Mali had seeded, was known across the Muslim world as one of the greatest scholars of his generation. His works on Islamic jurisprudence and biography were read and cited in Cairo and Fez. He came from a family that had been producing scholars in Timbuktu for generations, in a tradition of learning that stretched back to the patronage of Mansa Musa and Mansa Suleiman. When Ahmed Baba was eventually seized by Moroccan soldiers after the 1591 invasion and taken to Marrakesh, he was able to debate legal theory with the Sultan's scholars from memory. He had reportedly left 600 books behind in Timbuktu when he was taken, more than most European scholars owned, in a city that contained hundreds of comparable collections. This is the civilization that the Mali Empire built and that its collapse made vulnerable. It did not require the Mali Empire to survive. It persisted through the Songhai period and into the 17th century. But it required the conditions that the Mali Empire had created: the commercial wealth, the political stability, the tradition of royal patronage of scholarship, to thrive. When those conditions were disrupted, first by Malian decline, and then by Songhai conquest, and finally by the Moroccan invasion of 1591, the intellectual culture that had made Timbuktu one of the great cities of the medieval world was damaged in ways from which it never fully recovered. The gold still exists. It is still coming out of the Mali basin. The trade routes still cross the Sahara, in different forms, carrying different goods by different means. Timbuktu still stands, its great mosque still standing, the manuscripts in its libraries still being preserved and catalogued by scholars who understand what they are. The civilization that built all of this did not vanish when the empire did. What vanished was the specific political mechanism that had organized, protected, and extracted wealth from it for 2 centuries. Mansa Musa crossed the Sahara with 100 camel loads of gold and announced to the world that there was a state in the interior of Africa that had mastered the logic of continental trade on a scale that no other medieval polity could match. Within a century of his death, that state was gone. The gold was still there. The routes were still there. The cities were still there. The scholars were still there. Only the state that had put them all together was gone, consumed by the very success it had achieved, unraveled by the succession system it could never fix, and overwhelmed by rivals who were willing to be as ruthless about acquiring wealth as it had once been about accumulating it. The richest kingdom in history did not fall to poverty. It fell to the weight of its own history, to the accumulated decisions, compromises, and failures of more than 2 centuries, and to the cold arithmetic of power, which does not care how magnificent the ceremony is when the army is no longer there to back it up.